I hold an unconventional position within the realm of information technology, affording me the luxury of working remotely from my own home. This unique circumstance, however, necessitates that I operate during nighttime hours. On a chilly February night a number of years back, while deeply immersed in my tasks, I was abruptly jarred by the sound of the coat rack in my living room rattling, a sound that typically arises when the front door is opened. Initially, my assumption was that my spirited feline companion had found her way onto the coats, a playful escapade she often indulged in when brimming with energy. My intention was to intervene before any damage could be done to my new jacket. To my astonishment, instead of encountering my mischievous pet, I was confronted by a total stranger. This individual promptly demanded the whereabouts of his possessions, as I persistently asserted for roughly 5 minutes that I possessed no knowledge of his identity. Over time, his threats escalated into a more forceful demeanor. My phone happened to be situated in another room, and I hesitated to turn my back on this individual due to an instinctual suspicion that he could pose a threat. His behavior seemed to indicate that he was intoxicated, potentially under the influence of substances that exacerbated his aggression. The fact that he had managed to enter my apartment without authorization filled me with dread, leaving me utterly bewildered by the unfolding situation. Thankfully, a Christmas gift from the previous year came to my rescue: an elegant umbrella with a handle resembling that of a Japanese katana. Although it had set me back almost £200, the investment proved invaluable. Its remarkably authentic appearance occasionally made me self-conscious when carrying it in public. This umbrella had a retractable design, resembling a diminutive katana rather than a cumbersome sword. While I can't recall its exact name, I'm confident that someone in the comments section could provide that information. In addition, it was outfitted with a synthetic leather sheath, further enhancing its resemblance to a small sword when holstered. This particular attribute played a pivotal role in preserving my safety that fateful night. Without hesitation, I seized the umbrella and firmly grasped its handle, as if poised to unsheath a blade. To my astonishment, this action had a profound impact on the intruder. His natural response was to raise his hands in a gesture of supplication, as though I held a deadly weapon. He began to retreat, promising to exit if I allowed him the opportunity. However, due to my inadvertent positioning, I had to navigate cautiously around him to create an escape route. All the while, I couldn't escape the concern that if he were to challenge my resolve, I would find myself unarmed, equipped solely with an umbrella. My knowledge of whether he was armed remained non-existent. Fortunately, he was not, and armed with nothing but a trusty umbrella, I successfully escorted him out of my residence, emphatically shutting the door behind him. Following this harrowing experience, I hastened to my bedroom, which doubled as my office at the time, and promptly contacted the police. Even to this day, I remain puzzled as to how the intruder managed to infiltrate my living space. The police hypothesized that I might have inadvertently left the door unlocked, advising me to modify the locks for added security. While not the most reassuring resolution, it was the extent of their capabilities. Regrettably, the individual was never apprehended, leaving me in the dark regarding the motives behind his intrusion. The incident continues to weigh on my mind, prompting me to now double-check the front door's closure each night, just in case this traumatic encounter was merely the result of a peculiar oversight, leading to one of the most unsettling events of my life. Following my time in the military, I settled in a secluded region of Arkansas. Living alone, my financial constraints led me to opt for an economical choice: a roomy yet neglected 3-bedroom, 2-story house. The real estate agent probably anticipated my intentions to renovate, but my primary goal was simply to have a quiet retreat far from the commotion of urban life. It fulfilled this purpose perfectly. Positioned right beside the highway, the house was linked to a few neighboring properties a couple of acres away by a dirt road. One night, close to midnight, as I remained awake in my study with a view of the front porch through a window, something captured my attention. The room was dimly illuminated and suddenly I could have sworn I heard voices emanating from the porch. Alert and on edge, I strained to listen, but the words remained unintelligible. Nonetheless, I remained convinced that someone was conversing. During that period, the front door and most windows of the house lacked blinds or any means of concealment, except for the window in my office. It was a security vulnerability I hadn't yet addressed, considering my remote location. Consequently, I rarely bothered to lock my doors. In hindsight, I believe the front door might have been locked, but in that moment, I couldn't recall for certain. Furthermore, there were too many exposed windows to easily go around and secure them, at least given my overly cautious mindset. Thankfully, most of the lights were off, enabling me to quietly withdraw to my bedroom down the hallway. Exercising caution, I retrieved my shotgun, locked the bedroom door, and positioned myself, prepared to react. I distinctly remember placing my iPhone at the base of the door, activating the camera to survey the connecting hallway. This makeshift surveillance was my effort to monitor any potential intruders. Thankfully, I didn't detect anyone. Fatigue eventually overcame me, and I managed to fall asleep a few hours later. Several days later, I learned from a neighbor on the dirt road that their son, who had been arrested in another state, had managed to escape and sought refuge in that very house. It turned out that the voices I heard on my porch coincided with his return. The authorities eventually located and apprehended him. Astonishingly, his hiding place was only half a mile away from my residence. During a time when I was still residing with my parents in Idaho, their house occupied a rather isolated spot. This meant I had to drive around 20 minutes just to reach a county road. After that, an additional 40 minutes were required to get to the city where both my school and job were located. My daily routine involved attending classes in the morning and afternoon, followed by tending bar at a small steakhouse at night to supplement my income for various expenses. Those shifts often extended well past 11 p.m., and afterward, we had to perform breakdown and cleaning tasks that usually wrapped up around 12:30 or 1 a.m. On a specific evening, I was driving home, utterly fatigued. As I approached the end of the paved road, I accelerated down a narrow dirt pathway. The surrounding darkness, typical of rural areas, enclosed me, with only a small cone of headlights piercing through the obscurity ahead. On both sides of the route, walls of scrub brush and grass formed a tunnel-like effect, adorned with uneven branches. While maneuvering around a bend, a sight caught my attention right in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, causing a cloud of dust to billow ahead. Through the haze, I discerned a white shape hunched over, directly illuminated by my headlights. This figure possessed elongated legs and haunches reminiscent of a jackrabbit, yet it stood impressively at a height of 4 feet and displayed a somewhat irregular form, akin to illustrations from those unsettling storybooks, if you recall them. It goes without saying that I was petrified, immobilized in my driver's seat, desperately attempting to rationalize the peculiar sight before me. The figure swayed back and forth, shivering. Its silhouette proved utterly confounding. I stared at it for a solid minute, my car idling in the middle of the road, trying to piece together a logical explanation for this bizarre encounter. Yet, I was thoroughly puzzled. Gradually, I began inching the car forward. As I approached, the muscular shapes and gleaming fur of the creature became discernible. Abruptly, it leaped up, revealing what seemed like a head with an elongated ear. It stretched upward, altering its entire shape, much akin to the beings in science fiction films. In that instant, I emitted a terrified shriek, undoubtedly sounding more high-pitched than I'd care to admit. The creature remained largely concealed, except for its white striped legs and underbelly. However, what I initially mistook for a sizable jet-black sphere resting by the roadside stood upright, uncovering a portion of its body that had been hidden behind folded black legs. It staggered off into the bushes, evidently seeking a place to rest undisturbed by the glare of high beams. I realize you might assume I felt foolish afterward, and indeed I did. However, at that moment, when it elevated itself like an unfolding monstrosity, I can honestly say I had never experienced such terror in my entire life. I had no inkling of what I was observing. The combination of exhaustion and the darkness had already played tricks on my eyes. It was a perfect storm of circumstances that led me to believe I was facing a creature about to pounce on my car or something of the sort. Since that incident in the early 2000s, I've always exercised extra caution while driving at night, particularly in rural locales. The experience is entirely distinct out there. So, if you find yourself driving in the countryside at night, exercise care, folks. It's an entirely different situation. To commence, let me clarify that during that time, I was young, inexperienced, and earnestly trying to be of assistance. I held the night shift at a customer service position when I was around 19 years old. Physical strength wasn't my forte, and regular exercise wasn't part of my routine. Furthermore, I didn't possess any means of self-defense, as I lacked valuable belongings to warrant such precautions. Back then, the prospect of a robbery didn't particularly weigh on my mind, given the presence of several bars nearby and the typical weekend atmosphere. On one night, after completing my shift around 2 a.m. in Syracuse, New York, an individual approached me as I entered my car, inquiring about a lighter. I politely informed him of my lack thereof. His next request was for a brief ride down the street, for reasons I can't quite fathom, perhaps due to boredom or curiosity. I agreed. In retrospect, I now recognize the imprudence of that choice. We travelled for a short distance, and then he asked me to pull over. As he exited the car, it became evident that he was homeless. He made his way to a nearby bus stop, where he retrieved a makeshift cigarette and lighter from a hidden spot he had set up. He then returned to the car and asked for a ride back, explaining his lack of transportation. Against my better judgment, I thought, why not? And allowed him back in. Our conversation continued during the drive. However, the situation took a sudden, unsettling turn when I pulled over once more. Abruptly, he fell into a deep silence, staring fixedly ahead. A wave of anxiety washed over me, and thoughts of potential danger flooded my mind. I glanced at him, repeatedly asking if everything was all right. Eventually, I bid my farewells, stating my need to head home. Whatever troubling episode he was undergoing seemed to dissipate, and he thanked me before leaving the car. I'm about 80% certain that had I displayed panic, the situation might have escalated, possibly resulting in an attack. He bore an air that hinted at contemplation of something sinister, yet lacked the determination to carry it through. Perhaps my capacity to connect with him on a personal level dissuaded him, or perhaps he saw nothing valuable in me. Since that occurrence, I strictly adhered to a policy of refraining from offering rides to strangers. This stance might seem unjust, especially considering I must shoulder the blame for my own lapse in judgment during that incident. However, I no longer feel at ease subjecting myself to potential risks involved in providing rides to unfamiliar individuals. It might seem odd, but during my childhood, I had an unusual nightly routine. Whenever sleep eluded me, I would venture to my bedroom window and peer into the darkness outside. There was something captivating about the serenity and obscurity of the night. I would console myself with the thought that everyone else was asleep, and I should be too. Then, I would commence counting our neighbours, envisioning them in peaceful slumber. Following that, I would tally up various nocturnal creatures, convincing myself of their deep rest. This ritual would eventually lull me into drowsiness, guiding me back to bed and allowing me to drift into sleep. However, a single night shattered this tranquil pattern, replacing it with sheer terror that sent me sprinting to my parents' room. As usual, I was engrossed in my window observance when, out of nowhere, I beheld an individual vaulting over our backyard fence. Unmistakably a person, their size was far too substantial to be mistaken for an animal. Yet their movements seemed oddly unnatural. Reflecting on it now, they might have been a criminal or someone fleeing from the authorities. Nonetheless, at that moment, under the moon's glow, they appeared as a creature from a nightmare. Cautiously scanning their surroundings, their head darted frantically before finding concealment behind a bush. I was paralyzed with fear, dreading the prospect of an attack on our home. Time stretched infinitely as I awaited signs of help. After agonizing minutes, they stealthily approached our house and vanished into the shadows. Panic overwhelmed me, and I rushed to my parents, sobbing about an impending monster invasion. Initially brushed off as a bad dream, my insistence on an intruder lurking outside caused my father's demeanor to shift abruptly. He retrieved an old Louisville slugger from the bedroom closet and descended the stairs, prepared to confront the trespasser. To my immense relief, no one was there. I assumed the person had fled after realizing they couldn't breach our defenses, but in that instant, I was inconsolable. My father's readiness to protect us affirmed my belief that danger was imminent. The dread of him being harmed consumed me, as he was my protector. This fear triggered a full-blown panic until his return finally reassured me. My parents often recount this story, most recently sharing it with a girl I was dating, who found it equally amusing. In retrospect, I find it amusing too. I was, after all, just a frightened child. Nevertheless, the memory of that night remains indelible in my mind, a testament to the profound fear I felt, even after all these years.